All right, let's move on to the session for wheat diseases. Chris and Christina will be in charge of that. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure, I can start and hand it over to Chris. My name is Christina Hagerty. I'm a dryland cereal pathologist based in Pendleton. And I also just want to take an opportunity to thank Debbie for putting this together. The virtual field day is very new and she just ran with it. So huge thanks to Debbie. Also our director, Mary, and then just all the people that go into pulling this research off, our farmer cooperators who have to work around our plots, Oregon Wheat Commission, my FRA, Duncan Cruzy, and then Kyle Harrison and Kyle Bender for keeping our beautiful stations running. So my videos for field day included 2 topics, soil-borne wheat mosaic virus and fusarium crown rot. While I'm happy to answer questions or talk about that, Chris Mundt and I coordinated, and with the situation with stripe rust and magic, we thought that stripe rust was probably something that you all would want to hear about. And I guess before turning it over to Chris, I just thought that I'd mention when we have these issues with resistance in stripe rust, we have an opportunity to open up the marketplace for producers to consider other varieties. And that diversity is in varieties is something that I think is quite important for us to seriously consider. And so I'll turn it over to Chris Mundt, and then hoping that Bob and Ryan can jump in on this discussion of stripe rust. Chris, I think you're on mute.
Okay. Thanks, Christina. And so I'm Chris Mundt. I'm a cereals pathologist stationed in Corvallis, but I try to cover the state as best I can. And I just want to start by thanking all the folks at CBARC. I've been working with folks there for almost 35 years, believe it or not, and it's been a really nice collaboration that I really appreciate. So as everyone has seen, the planes are flying, and UI Magic has been a great variety for producers, and based on the Oregon Wheat Commission Variety Survey, it's covering 70% of the total acreage in the entire state of Oregon. And it's also a variety that's genetically very uniform because it was developed through a dihaploid system. So basically, it's a big petri plate for a fungus to adapt to, and it looks like that clearly has happened this year, unfortunately. And UI Magic has always been susceptible to wheat stripe rust, but it's kind of gone off the charts this year. And just to give you an example, I was out at Bob's plots at the rug site a couple weeks ago, and usually the first thing I do when I go out there, I always look at Stevens because we've looked at Stevens forever. And then for rust, I then often go to Mary, and if there's rust around, usually you'll see rust on Mary. And I really had to struggle to find any rust on Mary, and then I got to Magic. And it was 50% severity already, and it looked like it was going to be 100% the next week. Bob was there the next week and said that, yeah, it was 90% anyway. Although we've had a somewhat conducive environment in terms of low temperatures and some rainfall, there's no question in my mind that this is being driven by a different race of stripe rust. And I think Christina and Bob and Ryan have all come to the same conclusion. But just to give you some more observations on that, I also have rust trials down here in Corvallis. I took the data on that a few weeks ago, and at that point, the variety Brawl was about 90%, and that's a very highly susceptible variety. And when I got to the Magic plots, that was only about 30%. And so we don't grow any Clearfield varieties down here in the Willamette Valley, so there hasn't been selection for the races that are going to attack Magic. And so I think that's another piece of evidence that over on the east side of the mountains, there's races that are hitting it pretty hard. And obviously that can happen when you have that much of the acreage that's grown to the same variety. So we definitely want to talk about varieties. Before we get to that, I want to mention just a couple things about fungicides. And I've got a few calls this year from people who said, gee, I had a bunch of rust blow up and I sprayed my fungicide. It doesn't look like it's working really well. And this is something I have to remind people of, every so many years, is that when you're talking about fungicides, timing is everything. And one of the things that you see with stripe rust, which can increase very, very quickly, is you have this thing that's called the latent period. And so when the fungus lands on the leaf and there's moisture, it gets into the leaf. At this time of year, there's about a 2-week period from the time the fungus gets in the leaf until you actually see those rust pustules on the leaf, okay? And so if you have something that's increasing very quickly, if you see 1 or 2 or 3 or 5% rust, you might have enough rust out there to see 30% 2 weeks later. If you don't put on your fungicide until you've got 20% rust out in the field, you're really going to be in a world of hurt. And you've got a whole bunch of infections that have not yet expressed. And the fungicides that we put on can only reach back a certain number of days to kill the infections that happen. So they can't really reach back the entire 2 weeks to kill it off. So making sure that you get the fungicide on before the fungus gets away from you is really, really important. And then the other thing I want to mention, we often get some questions about products. And as we often say, what you spray is probably less important than when you spray it. And certainly for our producers in the drier areas like Sherman County, Morrow County, you don't have a lot of options economically. And in those drier areas, putting on the cheapest thing you can find is going to do the job. There's really no need to put on one of the more expensive compounds. Now you start getting into your higher rainfall areas, maybe the Milton-free water area, for example. Then if you're talking about being up in the 120, 140 bushel area, you can afford to put on some of these products that have multiple modes of action in the same product, and they will do a better job. But down in the dryland areas, the cheapest thing, propiconazole, tebuconazole, something like that is going to do the job for you. So in terms of varieties, one of the many advantages of the variety Magic is that it had relatively, broad adaptation. So it's grown in a lot of areas on the east side of the Cascades, and it has done fairly well. Fortunately, in recent years, there's been some more releases of 2-gene clearfields that have come out that have better stripe rust resistance. And they may or may not be as broadly adapted as Magic, but there are certain varieties that seem to be well adapted agronomically to certain production environments. And I think we have to get away from growing Magic. Unfortunately, that's just the way it looks. And so we need to figure out which of our 2-gene clearfields that have been released from the Oregon program, the Washington program, the Idaho program, the private sector. There's several different options out there. And this is where I kind of need to call in, Ryan and Bob Zemetra. We have folks on here from Washington, get their input as well. And I think we really need to kind of talk about, which varieties might do well in different production environments. And if we have any representatives of our seedsmen here, a big question obviously is going to be, how much seed do we have of these different varieties, and how fast can we get these guys cranked up? Because we don't want to be growing 70% Magic 2 years from now. I think we'll really be in a lot of trouble. So, Ryan, should I take questions on that, or do you and Bob want to make some comments on variety selection now, or in your section?
So the variety sessions next, my guess is there's gonna be some sort of intermediate phase where we talk about, I think when we talk about the stripe rust, we really need to be talking about the varieties as well. But maybe if there's anything else, or anything that you'd like to cover in the disease section, or anything that anybody would like to ask that doesn't pertain to varieties, maybe we go there first.
I just have a couple quick comments if I can just kind of echo what Chris was talking about in terms of latent period. Is it okay if I jump in real quick?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so can everyone see the photo of the leaf with some young pustules up on the screen? Thank you, Debbie. Basically, what Chris was referring to in terms of latent period is when you're scouting fields and looking at infection and severity and deciding on a fungicide application. This is a photo that I took last year where you can see the lesions forming, but then you have this chlorotic ring around that. And depending on whether this entire chlorotic area, that light green area, could turn into a rust infection in a matter of hours. And, you know, with stripe rust, it's such a challenging disease to manage because in terms of its ability to spread and infection, what's good for the crop is also typically good for stripe rust. And so what we saw this year with that, you know, beautiful late season rain that will really improve yield is we saw what was a maybe slightly above average or normal stripe rust year that really bumped us into kind of that big boom and with all the planes flying. So that's just kind of what I wanted to mention. And then the other thing that also echoes what Chris said is I'll be so curious to see what happens in terms of stripe rust races at the end of the season, because the varieties that we scout, you know, Mary 101 Fusion really looked pretty good. And it was, Magic was really the standout in terms of having a problem this year. So that's kind of just what I wanted to discuss. We've been, fungicide trials for stripe rust are very challenging, and we've been working on this in Pendleton for the last 4 years. And again, to echo what Chris says, timing of product is so much more important than the product that you choose. And that's what our data reveal kind of year after year.
Go ahead. Okay, just a quick question, like the propiconazole, a lot of farmers use it, you know, with their regular spray. And that would have been like 2 months ago. And how long does that propiconazole last? It sure didn't, obviously didn't last the season this year, but is it good for about a month?
No, well, you know, a lot of people figure that it's good for about 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Oh.
But then, so let's say you've got that fungicide on, it lasts for 2 weeks, and you get an infection. Then you've got to go through a latent period before you actually see that. Now you get earlier in the year, and your latent period might be more like 4 weeks rather than 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
So you could see 6 weeks from the time you put it on until you actually see rust pop up. And I think that's very often what growers are seeing, that propiconazole is kind of wearing off in terms of what they're seeing by about 5 weeks, which would fit with a 2 week protection period and a 3 week latent period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like, so what Christina was showing, that little pustule there, and our fields were just like that. We just found it, and then boom, in 3 days, you know, it was chlorotic, and
yeah.
Luckily it didn't get totally into the flag leaves. So.
Again, it can't be overemphasized for people to be out there and looking. And I realize you guys got some big fields and you've got a lot of hills and things like that, but it's it's really worth your effort to be out there. And one of the things I do is, I tend to look along the diversions and things like that, where you're going to have a little bit more moisture. The plant's going to be a little bit more juicy, some of the swales and things like that. But anything you can do to cover the field is time well spent.
Yeah, it was shocking how fast the whole field turned yellow. It's like, oh, we were lucky. We got one of the first ones on the flight schedule. But yeah, I know in Wasco County, the pilot he said he was 15,000 acres behind for a while.
Wow.
It was just, overwhelming.
Yeah.
Hey, Chris and Christina, this is Chad, and I would just add to it from some of the things that I've seen from a commercial perspective that would encompass a lot of these people is, the rate and timing is important. So timing is absolutely critical, but also the rate. And when we're starting to talk about the length of control and what has happened throughout the years is propiconazole, when it was priced higher, used to be used at 2 ounces per acre at herbicide timing, and you wouldn't get that, 2 weeks of control out of 2 ounces. Now the price of propiconazole has come down, and more growers, Ernie, you might be one that at herbicide timing you're using 4 ounces because that cost has come down. But even other products like Preaxor, Trivapro, or even some of those products, you're definitely seeing a length of control by rate. And I think that's one thing that's really, really important to kind of keep in mind as well. Not only timing, but rate and length of control.
Yeah, if you're growing a highly susceptible variety, I'd always go with the full rate. An exception to that might be if you have a variety that has intermediate resistance and you're not sure whether you really need a spray or not, then you can probably get away with it. But anything that's highly susceptible, I think you want that whole rate on there to get that length of protection.
And we had a trial in Milton Freewater sloping down into the Walla Walla Valley there, and there was rust detected at the end of February. And this happens to be magic to go along with your point, but the rust was already there at the end of February. And those untreated checks at this point are absolutely 100% finessed and completely orange. So that helps reiterate what you and Christina are talking about from a variety perspective. But where we treated it and we used the right products to treat it, we've got treatments that are 100% full foliage from top to bottom. Wow. With no infections of rice today. And so there are some things we can do to protect things based on timing, which is absolutely critical, and then rate of the fungicides applied.
Yeah, our real challenges come in with the the growers in the lower rainfall regions, and they just really can't afford to be putting on a lot of fungicides, and so that's where we really get stuck.
And I think from there, in terms of figuring out how to control any plant disease, I always think of it as we've got an expensive way to control diseases and a very cheap way to control diseases. And that cheap way really falls on genetic resistance. And where a fungicide application may not be necessary if we've got that genetic resistance.
Okay, and what I was going to mention, the first comment was on Chris's timing comment. In Hislop, we have a strip of magic, and next to a trial that needed spraying, and Chris sprayed the border magic, but not the rest of the strip. And what he sprayed is still green. What he didn't spray is dead. So I was surprised we had mostly burned off leaves on it. Couple comments on deploying and not deploying susceptible wheats is that stripe rust, our new races are going to come about through mutation, and the only way you're going to get a new race then is having high spore production. So when you do get a susceptible line out and you get rust production, you're increasing the odds that you're going to get new races produced. So from a management of a disease, as Christina said, it's essential to have resistant lines. Something else that I've seen is what I call rust by association. A line with moderate resistance grown next to a field that's susceptible, you're going to see expression of rust in the moderately resistant line just by the sheer, my term as not a pathologist, sheer load of rust spores. And I've also seen the other way that you have resistant lines, varieties being grown near moderate resistant lines, and you'll see a decrease in the rust expression. So deployment of resistant varieties is key, not just from a profitability standpoint, but to manage the disease.
Should we talk a little bit about varieties with resistance to stripe rust? Or is there anything else with the disease category that, or before we?
Between Christina and I, we're working on, 10 or 12 diseases, but I think the important thing right now is the stripe rust. So Christina can chime in, but I think this would be a good point for you and Bob to start talking about the varieties and where they might be adapted. Does that make sense to you, Christina?
Oh, definitely. That'd be great.
Great.